I'm standing in my penthouse office on the 47th floor, watching two figures approach the security desk downstairs through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The woman in the red dress walks with that same confident stride I once loved. The man beside her moves with the easy swagger I used to call my best friend. They're here. After 3 years of radio silence, they've finally come to see what I've built. My name is Marcus, and this is the story of how the two people who destroyed my life became the first witnesses to my resurrection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years ago, I was a different man, smaller in every way that mattered. I lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Chicago, sharing the space with my wife Sarah and working 60-hour weeks at a software consulting firm that paid me just enough to keep the lights on. My best friend Jake lived 2 blocks away in an identical building, and most evenings you'd find the three of us crammed around my tiny kitchen table, sharing takeout and dreams that felt impossibly distant. Sarah was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Blonde hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, green eyes that could make me forget whatever stupid argument we'd been having, and a laugh that made the walls of our shoebox apartment feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office, bringing home stories about difficult patients and office drama that we'd dissect over dinner like it was the most important news in the world. Jake was the kind of friend you think you'll have forever. We'd known each other since high school, survived college together, and he was the best man at my wedding. He had this way of making everything seem possible, even when the bank account was empty and the bills were piling up. He worked in sales at a car dealership, always chasing the next big commission, always convinced that his luck was about to turn around. The three of us had this routine. Friday nights were sacred. Jake would bring beer, Sarah would order pizza, and we'd spend hours planning our escape from the mundane. We called ourselves the Dreamers Club, which sounds ridiculous now, but back then it felt revolutionary. We'd sketch out business plans on napkins, research investment opportunities we couldn't afford, and make elaborate charts showing how we were going to retire by 40. I remember one particular Friday in February. Snow was falling outside, and our heater was making that rattling sound that meant it was probably going to die soon. We were huddled around the coffee table with Chinese takeout containers and a bottle of cheap wine Sarah had brought home. Jake was explaining his latest get-rich-quick scheme involving cryptocurrency, gesturing wildly with his chopsticks. "Marcus, listen to me," he said, leaning forward with that intensity he got when he was excited about something. "Bitcoin is going to hit $50,000. I'm telling you, we need to get in now while we still can." Sarah rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "Jake, you said the same thing about that protein powder business last month." "That was different," Jake protested. "This is real. Marcus, back me up here. You understand tech better than anyone." I was working on a mouthful of lo me in, but I nodded thoughtfully. The truth was, I did understand technology better than most people. I'd been coding since I was 12, had a computer science degree from Northwestern, and spent my days solving complex problems for clients who paid my company 3 times what they paid me. But understanding technology and having the capital to invest in it were 2 entirely different things. "The fundamentals are sound," I said carefully, "but we'd need at least 10,000 to make it worth the risk, and none of us have 10,000 lying around." That was the truth that hung over everything we did. We had dreams but no capital, ideas but no connections, ambition but no clear path forward. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand, and for a moment I felt that familiar surge of contentment. This was enough. We were enough. The three of us against the world, planning our revolution one Friday night at a time. The apartment was small, but it was ours. The jobs were mediocre, but they paid the bills. The dreams were distant, but they kept us warm when the heater rattled and died, and we had to wait until Monday for the landlord to fix it. I look back on those nights now with something that isn't quite nostalgia, but isn't quite regret either. They were real in a way that very little in my life had been real before or since. But reality has a way of crashing through even the strongest delusions. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in March. I came home from work early, fighting off a migraine that had been building all day. The office had been particularly brutal, with a client breathing down our necks about a project that was technically impossible, but somehow still our responsibility to deliver. My boss, a perpetually stressed man named Peterson who lived on energy drinks and passive aggression, had spent the morning explaining to me why the laws of physics were merely suggestions when it came to client satisfaction. I fumbled with my keys at the apartment door, head pounding and vision slightly blurred. The lock stuck, the way it always did when the weather was changing, and I had to lean my full weight against the door to get it open. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside, which was unusual for a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah's car had been in the parking lot, so I knew she was home, but I didn't hear the television or the music she usually played while doing housework. I called out her name as I hung my jacket on the hook by the door. No response. The living room was empty, takeout containers from the night before still scattered across the coffee table. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, keys beside it, but no sign of Sarah herself. I figured she might be taking a nap. She'd been working extra shifts lately, covering for a coworker who'd quit without notice. The bedroom door was closed, which should have been my first warning. Sarah never closed doors during the day, unless she was changing clothes or taking a phone call she didn't want me to hear. I turned the handle slowly, not wanting to wake her if she was sleeping, and pushed the door open just wide enough to peer inside. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. I could see movement under the covers, the rhythmic shifting that meant Sarah was definitely awake. I was about to call out to her again when I heard the sound that changed everything. A low masculine grunt that definitely didn't come from my wife. Time moves differently in moments like that. Your brain tries to process information that doesn't fit the framework of your reality, and everything slows down while it works through the impossible. I stood in that doorway for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, watching the covers move in a pattern that told a story I didn't want to understand. Then I heard Jake's voice, low and urgent, saying something I couldn't quite make out. And Sarah's laugh, breathless and delighted, the same laugh she used to save for me when we were alone, and the world was quiet and nothing existed except the space between us. I backed away from the door without making a sound. My hands were shaking, and that migraine had transformed into something sharper and more immediate. I felt like I was going to be sick, but I also felt strangely detached, like I was watching this happen to someone else from a very great distance. The smart thing would have been to leave, walk out of the apartment, get in my car, and drive somewhere safe where I could process what I'd just discovered. But I wasn't feeling particularly smart in that moment. Instead, I found myself walking back toward the bedroom, drawn by a masochistic need to confirm what I already knew. This time I didn't try to be quiet. I pushed the door open wide and stepped inside, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. The movement under the covers stopped immediately. There was a moment of absolute silence, and then Sarah's head appeared above the comforter, her hair wild and her face flushed. She saw me standing there and her expression cycled through a dozen emotions in the span of a heartbeat. Surprise, fear, guilt, defiance, and finally something that looked almost like relief. Behind her, Jake's face emerged from under the covers, and I was struck by how young he looked, like a kid who'd been caught sneaking cookies before dinner. Nobody said anything for what felt like an eternity. We just stared at each other across the wreckage of everything I thought I knew about my life. Sarah pulled the sheet up to cover herself, but it was too late for modesty. Jake sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment I thought he might try to explain this away somehow. Come up with some story that would make this not what it obviously was. But he didn't. He just looked at me with those brown eyes I'd trusted for 15 years and said, "Marcus, man, I'm sorry you had to see this. Not sorry it happened, sorry I had to see it." As if the problem was my presence, not their betrayal. as if walking in on my wife and best friend in my own bed was simply a matter of poor timing, rather than the complete destruction of everything I'd built my adult life around. Sarah found her voice first. "Marcus, I can explain." I heard myself laugh, a sound that came from somewhere deep and bitter. "Can you? Because I'm really curious how you're going to explain this away." She pulled the sheet tighter around herself and sat up straighter, and I could see her shifting into defensive mode. "You're never here. You work all the time. We never talk anymore." The accusations hit like physical blows, too familiar, too rehearsed, like she'd been practicing this speech for weeks. Maybe she had been. Maybe this moment had been inevitable, and I was the only one who didn't see it coming. "So this is my fault," I said. It wasn't a question. Jake finally climbed out of the bed, not bothering to cover himself as he reached for his clothes. The casual way he moved through my bedroom, the comfortable familiarity of his actions, told me this wasn't the first time. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a relationship. "Nobody's saying it's your fault," Jake said, pulling on his jeans. "But you've got to admit, things haven't been great between you two for a while." I stared at him, this person I'd considered family, and tried to reconcile the man putting on his shirt in my bedroom with the friend who'd been planning our futures around my kitchen table just days earlier.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The disconnect was so complete it felt surreal. "How long?" I asked. Sarah and Jake exchanged a look, and in that glance I saw volumes of communication. They'd had this conversation before. They'd planned for this moment, discussed what they would say when I inevitably found out. The coordination between them was like a knife twisting in my chest. "Does it matter?" Sarah said finally. "It matters to me." Another exchange of glances. Jake finished buttoning his shirt and sat down on the edge of the bed. My bed, like he belonged there. "About 8 months," he said. 8 months. I did the math quickly in my head. That meant it started last summer, right around the time Sarah and I had been talking about trying for kids. While I was lying awake at night planning our future family, she was planning her escape with my best friend. I felt something break inside me then. Not just my heart, although that was certainly shattered. Something deeper and more fundamental. The part of me that trusted the world to make sense, that believed people meant what they said, and that love was more than just convenient, temporary arrangement. "I want you out," I said quietly. Sarah's defiance crumbled, and for a moment she looked like the woman I'd married, vulnerable and scared, and somehow smaller than she'd seemed just minutes before. "Marcus, please. We need to talk about this. We needed to talk about this 8 months ago. Before you decided to have this conversation with Jake instead of me." Jake stood up and walked toward me, and I tensed, unsure what he was planning. But he just stopped a few feet away and looked me in the eye with something that might have been genuine remorse. "I never meant for it to happen like this," he said. "We tried to fight it." "Did you?" I asked, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you tried pretty hard to make it happen. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did Sarah. They just stood there in my bedroom, surrounded by the detritus of their deception, waiting for me to tell them what came next. But I didn't know what came next. I'd never been in this situation before. All my life, I'd been the reliable one, the steady one, the one people came to when they needed someone they could count on. I'd never been the one standing in the ruins of his own life, trying to figure out how to breathe around the wreckage. "I'm going for a walk," I said finally. "When I get back, I want you both gone." I turned and walked out of the bedroom, out of the apartment, out of the life I'd spent 5 years building. Behind me, I could hear Sarah crying and Jake's voice, low and soothing, comforting her. The sound followed me down the hallway and into the elevator, a reminder that even in this moment of ultimate betrayal, they had each other. I had no one. The walk turned into a drive that turned into 3 hours parked by Lake Michigan, staring out at the gray water and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The logical part of my brain kept trying to analyze the situation, to break it down into manageable components the way I would approach a complex coding problem. But this wasn't a problem that could be solved with logic. This was chaos, pure and simple, and I was drowning in it. When I finally returned to the apartment, they were gone. Sarah had taken most of her clothes and personal items, leaving behind a note that said she was staying with her sister and would be in touch about dividing our things. Jake had left nothing, not even an apology. The apartment felt enormous and impossibly empty, like a house after a funeral when all the mourners have gone home. I sat on the couch where the three of us had shared so many Friday night dreams and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do next. The practical considerations crowded in first. Could I afford the rent on my own? Probably. If I gave up everything that wasn't absolutely essential. Would I want to stay in this place that now felt haunted by their betrayal? Probably not, but moving required energy and decision-making capacity I wasn't sure I possessed. The deeper questions were harder. Who was I without Sarah? Without Jake? For so long my identity had been wrapped up in being part of their trio, being the steady foundation that allowed their more dramatic personalities to flourish. Without them, I felt untethered, like a satellite that had lost contact with mission control and was drifting aimlessly through space. I called in sick to work the next day, and the day after that, Peterson left increasingly irritated voicemails that I deleted without listening to completely. The clients could wait. The impossible projects could remain impossible for a few more days. I needed time to figure out how to be a person again. Sarah called on Thursday. I almost didn't answer, but something about the persistence of the ringing wore down my resistance. Her voice sounded small and distant through the phone, like she was calling from another planet. "Marcus, are you okay?" The question was so absurd I almost laughed. "No, Sarah, I'm not okay. I know this is hard, but we need to talk about practical things. The lease, our bank accounts, the car payments." She was right, of course. The mundane details of shared life don't pause for emotional catastrophe. Bills still needed to be paid, contracts still needed to be honored. The world keeps spinning even when your personal universe has collapsed. "Come by Saturday morning," I said. "We'll figure it out." "Okay. And Marcus, I really am sorry. I know that doesn't help, but I need you to know that. Sorry you got caught, or sorry it happened." She was quiet for a long moment. Both, I guess. That was probably as close to honesty as I was going to get from her. It wasn't enough, but it was something. A small acknowledgement that what had happened between us mattered, even if it hadn't mattered enough to prevent her from destroying it. Saturday came with unseasonable warmth for early April. I'd spent Friday cleaning the apartment obsessively, scrubbing away any trace of the life we'd shared, trying to reclaim the space as mine alone. When Sarah knocked on the door, I'd been ready for 20 minutes, documents spread across the kitchen table like evidence in a legal proceeding. She looked different, smaller like Jake had said, but also somehow more defined, as if losing the weight of our relationship had revealed sharper edges underneath. Her hair was shorter, cut in a style I'd never seen before, and she was wearing a dress I didn't recognize. New clothes for her new life. We divided our shared possessions with the efficiency of business partners dissolving a failing company. She could keep the car since her name was on the title. I would take over the lease since I made more money and had better credit. The bank accounts would be split down the middle, which wasn't much to split but would give us both enough to start over. It was all very civilized and mature and completely heartbreaking. We talked about furniture and kitchen appliances and who would keep which books, but underneath every practical decision was the unspoken acknowledgement that we were dismantling something that had once felt permanent, something we'd built together in hope and good faith before it all went wrong. "What about Jake?" I asked when we'd finished with the paperwork. Sarah looked uncomfortable for the first time that morning. "What about him? Are you too? Is this serious?" She studied her hands for a moment, and I could see her weighing how much truth she owed me. "I think so. Yes. Are you happy?" The question surprised both of us. I hadn't planned to ask it, and she clearly hadn't expected it. But I found that I genuinely wanted to know. Underneath all the hurt and anger and betrayal, there was still some small part of me that had loved her for 5 years and wanted her to be okay. "I am," she said quietly.
"I know that probably makes this worse for you, but yes, I'm happy." I nodded, because what else was there to do? She gathered up her copy of the paperwork and stood to leave, then paused at the door like she wanted to say something else. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're going to be okay. Better than okay. You're stronger than you think you are." "I don't feel very strong right now. That's what makes you strong. You're still here. You're still trying." After she left, I sat in the apartment that was now entirely mine and tried to figure out what she meant. I didn't feel like I was trying. I felt like I was barely surviving, moving through the motions of existence without any real sense of purpose or direction. But maybe that was enough for now. Maybe survival was the first step toward something bigger. Maybe the fact that I was still breathing, still paying bills, still showing up to work, despite everything that had fallen apart, maybe that counted as strength, even if it didn't feel like it. The following weeks passed in a blur of routine and adjustment. I went to work, came home to an apartment that echoed with every footstep, ordered takeout for one, and fell asleep watching television shows I didn't really care about. It wasn't a life so much as an existence, but it was mine. I started staying later at the office, partly because there was nothing to go home to, and partly because the work was beginning to interest me in ways it never had before. Without the distraction of a relationship, without the Friday night dreams and weekend plans, I found myself diving deeper into the technical challenges that had always been my strongest skill. Peterson noticed the change first. "You're different lately," he said one evening, when I was still at my desk at 8 o'clock, "more focused. Is that a problem?" "Hell no. It's the best thing that's happened to this place in months. That client project you've been working on. The impossible one. You actually made it work." I had made it work. The solution had come to me during one of those long evenings when I had nothing to go home to except an empty apartment and my own thoughts. Instead of fighting the technical limitations, I'd found a way to work within them, to turn the constraints into advantages rather than obstacles. It wasn't impossible, I said. It just required a different approach. Peterson sat down in the chair across from my desk, and I could see him studying me with new interest. "How would you feel about taking on some bigger challenges? More responsibility?" "What kind of bigger challenges?" "Leadership stuff, team management, maybe even some business development work." The old Marcus would have been terrified by the suggestion. Leadership required confidence and vision, qualities I'd never thought I possessed. But sitting there in that empty office, surrounded by code that I'd written and problems I'd solved, I felt something stirring that might have been ambition. "I'm interested," I said. That conversation changed everything. Within a month, I was leading a team of 3 other developers on a project that was bigger and more complex than anything our company had attempted before. The client was a financial services firm looking to modernize their entire technology infrastructure, and they were willing to pay premium rates for premium work. I discovered that I was good at leadership in ways I'd never expected. My years of being the steady, reliable one in my personal relationships translated surprisingly well to managing a team of brilliant but sometimes temperamental programmers. I could translate between the technical possibilities and the business requirements, finding solutions that satisfied both sides without compromising either. The project was successful beyond anyone's expectations, including my own. The client was so impressed with our work that they brought us in for 2 additional contracts, each larger than the last. My team grew from 3 people to 7, then to 12, and suddenly I wasn't just a senior developer anymore. I was a department head, with real authority and real responsibility for the success or failure of major initiatives.
The promotion came with a substantial raise, enough that I could afford to move out of the apartment that still carried echoes of my old life. I found a place in a better neighborhood, a one-bedroom with hardwood floors and windows that actually let in sunlight. It was the first space that had ever been entirely mine, decorated according to my tastes, organized according to my habits. I was building something new, not just a career, but an identity that wasn't defined by my relationships with other people. For the first time in my adult life, I was discovering who Marcus was when he didn't have to be anyone's husband or best friend or reliable support system. The answer surprised me. Without the need to be steady and accommodating for other people, I found reserves of ambition and creativity I'd never known existed. I started reading about business strategy and market analysis, subjects that had never interested me when I was focused on just getting by from paycheck to paycheck. I began to see patterns in the technology industry, opportunities that nobody else seemed to be pursuing. Late one night in my new apartment, working on a proposal for yet another client who wanted to revolutionize their digital presence, an idea began to form. It started small, just a nagging thought about inefficiencies I'd observed across multiple projects. But as I developed the concept further, it grew into something bigger and more ambitious. What if there was a way to streamline the entire process of business technology transformation? Not just the coding and implementation, but the strategy and planning phases as well. What if someone could create a platform that would allow companies to assess their needs, design solutions, and implement changes with a fraction of the time and cost currently required? The idea consumed me. I spent every free moment researching the market, analyzing competitors, and designing the technical architecture for what would eventually become the foundation of my company. I wrote business plans that I showed to no one, created financial projections based on conservative estimates of market demand, and slowly, carefully, began to believe that I might be onto something significant. 3 months after the idea first occurred to me, I had enough confidence in the concept to take the biggest risk of my life. I scheduled a meeting with Peterson and resigned from the company that had given me my start in leadership. "Are you insane?" Peterson asked when I explained my plans. "You're throwing away a guaranteed career path for some startup fantasy that has a 90% chance of failure." He wasn't wrong about the statistics. I'd read the same studies about entrepreneurial failure rates, but I'd also done the math on staying where I was, and the numbers told a different story. With a steady salary and annual raises, I might eventually reach the kind of financial security that would allow me to feel comfortable. But I would never reach the kind of success that would allow me to feel free. "Maybe," I said, "but I'd rather fail at something I built myself than succeed at something someone else built for me." That conversation happened on a Friday afternoon in late October, almost exactly 8 months after I'd walked in on Sarah and Jake. The timing felt symbolic, like I was completing some kind of transformation that had begun with the destruction of my old life. I spent the weekend in my apartment, surrounded by business plans and technical specifications, preparing for the most uncertain period of my life since college. But for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I was about to build. Monday morning, I woke up in my own apartment, with my own ideas and my own company to run. I had no employees yet, no office, no clients, and no guarantee that any of this would work. But I also had no one else's dreams to consider, no one else's fears to accommodate, no one else's limitations to accept as my own. I was completely alone, and I had never felt more powerful. 2 years into building my company, I was operating out of a shared workspace in River North, surrounded by other entrepreneurs who spoke in buzzwords and pitched ideas over overpriced coffee. The space hummed with ambition and desperation in equal measure, and most mornings I couldn't tell which category I belonged to. My platform was real now, not just lines of code on my laptop but an actual product with paying customers.
TechFlow Solutions had grown from my midnight obsession into a legitimate business with 17 clients across the Midwest. We were generating revenue, solving real problems, and I was finally paying myself a salary that covered more than just ramen noodles and rent. But success in the startup world is relative, and what felt like victory to me probably looked like small-time operations to anyone watching from the outside. I had 3 full-time employees working under me, 2 developers and a sales coordinator named Lisa, who had joined us after leaving a corporate job that was slowly killing her soul. We were profitable, which put us ahead of most startups, but we were still light years away from the kind of breakthrough that would change everything. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered in the form of an email from someone I'd never heard of at a company I definitely had heard of. DataCorp was one of the largest financial services firms in the country, with offices in 43 cities and a technology infrastructure that was simultaneously massive and completely obsolete. The email was from Rebecca Martinez, their chief technology officer, and it was refreshingly direct. They had a problem that was costing them millions of dollars annually, and they'd heard through industry contacts that my platform might be able to solve it. Would I be interested in discussing a potential partnership? I read the email 3 times before forwarding it to Lisa, then walked outside into the March wind to call my accountant. Not because I needed financial advice, but because I needed to hear another human being confirm that this was actually happening. DataCorp wants to meet with you. Tom's voice carried the same disbelief I was feeling. Marcus, do you understand what this could mean for your company? I understood, which was exactly why I was terrified. DataCorp wasn't just another client. They were the kind of company that could transform a small operation like mine into something entirely different, or destroy it completely if we couldn't deliver on whatever they were imagining. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at their headquarters downtown. I spent the week preparing obsessively, creating presentations and financial projections and technical demonstrations that covered every possible angle of inquiry. My team rallied around the opportunity with the kind of focused intensity that only comes when everyone understands that everything is about to change. Lisa drove me to the meeting because my hands were shaking too badly to trust myself behind the wheel. The DataCorp building was a monument to corporate success, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky like a modern cathedral. Security in the lobby was tighter than the airport, and the elevator that carried me to the 42nd floor was silent except for the subtle hum of serious money at work. Rebecca Martinez was not what I had expected. She was younger than me, probably early 30s, with short black hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't have time for small talk or posturing. Her office overlooked the Chicago River, and she offered me coffee from a machine that probably cost more than my first car. "I'll be honest with you, Marcus," she said, settling into a chair across from me. "We've been looking at this problem for 18 months. We've consulted with every major firm in the country, and everyone tells us the same thing. What we need is either impossible or would cost more than we're willing to spend."
She outlined the challenge methodically. DataCorp had grown through acquisition over the past decade, absorbing smaller firms and their disparate technology systems. The result was a nightmare of incompatible platforms, duplicate processes, and data silos that prevented their various divisions from communicating effectively with each other. They needed complete integration, but they also needed to maintain operational continuity during the transition. They couldn't afford downtime, couldn't risk data loss, and couldn't disrupt the daily operations that generated their revenue. It was like rebuilding an airplane while it was flying, and the technical requirements were staggering. "Everyone we've talked to wants to rip everything out and start over," Rebecca continued, "which would cost us somewhere between $50 and $80 million and take 3 to 5 years to implement. We'd probably lose half our clients during the transition." I had been listening carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions, but as she described their situation, I realized that this wasn't just a big project. This was the exact problem my platform had been designed to solve, scaled up to a size I'd never imagined possible. "What if you didn't have to rip everything out?" I asked. She looked skeptical. "What do you mean?" I opened my laptop and pulled up a demonstration I'd prepared, but not the one I'd originally planned to show. Instead, I walked her through a theoretical integration scenario, using DataCorp's actual structure as the framework. I showed her how my platform could create bridges between incompatible systems, how it could normalize data across different formats, and how it could implement changes incrementally rather than all at once. "The beauty of this approach," I explained, "is that you're not replacing your existing systems, you're teaching them to talk to each other. Each division can keep using the tools they're comfortable with, but now those tools are part of a larger network instead of isolated islands." Rebecca leaned forward, studying the demonstration with the intensity of someone who understood both the technical possibilities and the business implications. "How long would this take?" "For a company your size, probably 18 months for full implementation, but you'd start seeing benefits within the first quarter. And the cost?" This was the moment that would make or break everything. I had prepared conservative estimates, modest projections that would undercut the competition while still generating substantial profit for my company. But sitting in that office, looking at a problem that perfectly matched my solution, I realized that conservative thinking was exactly what had kept me small. $12 million, I said, plus performance bonuses based on measurable efficiency gains. It was 10 times larger than any contract my company had ever pursued. It was also, I was convinced, at least $20 million less than what anyone else would charge for comparable results. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see her running calculations in her head. Finally, she smiled, and I felt something shift in the room. "I'm going to need you to present this to our board of directors," she said. "But Marcus, I think you might have just solved a problem that's been keeping me awake at night for 2 years." The board presentation was scheduled for 3 weeks later, which gave me just enough time to completely redesign my business operations around the possibility of success. I hired 2 additional developers, rented office space that could accommodate a larger team, and worked with my accountant to establish the financial structures that would allow us to handle a contract of this magnitude. The presentation itself was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. 12 executives seated around a mahogany table that could have doubled as a small aircraft carrier, each one capable of approving or destroying my future with a simple vote. I had prepared for technical questions, financial inquiries, and implementation concerns. What I hadn't prepared for was the intensity of their interest. They didn't just want to know if my solution would work. They wanted to understand how it worked, why it was different from other approaches, and what would happen if DataCorp became the first major firm to implement this kind of technology. They were thinking beyond their immediate problem to the competitive advantages that early adoption might provide. The questions came rapid fire for almost 2 hours. Technical specifications, timeline projections, risk assessments, staffing requirements, intellectual property considerations, and scalability potential. I answered each one as thoroughly as I could, drawing on every piece of research and preparation I'd accumulated over the past month. But the question that caught me off guard came from their CEO, a silver-haired man named Douglas Chen, who had been mostly silent throughout the presentation. "Marcus," he said, "what happens to your company if this project fails?" It was a fair question, and the honest answer was that failure would probably destroy everything I'd built. I didn't have the resources to survive a $12 million mistake, and the reputational damage would make it almost impossible to recover in the industry. "With respect, sir," I said, "I think that's the wrong question. The right question is what happens to DataCorp if this project succeeds." Chen smiled, and I could see approval in his expression. "Enlighten me. You become the most technologically advanced financial services firm in the country. Your operational efficiency increases by at least 30%. Your ability to respond to market changes accelerates dramatically. And every one of your competitors spends the next 5 years trying to figure out how you pulled so far ahead of them. The room was silent for several seconds, then Chen nodded slowly. Rebecca, he said, I think we have our answer. The contract was signed 6 weeks later, after an exhaustive legal review that generated more paperwork than I'd seen in my entire career. But when I finally held that document in my hands, with Douglas Chen's signature authorizing $12 million for work that would be performed by a company I'd started in my apartment, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just success, but vindication. Proof that the ideas I'd developed in isolation, the solutions I'd crafted while sitting alone in empty offices, were not just viable but valuable. Revolutionary, even. The first phase of the DataCorp project launched 4 months later. My team had grown to 23 people, working out of a real office with conference rooms and a coffee machine that actually functioned properly. The shared workspace and overpriced lattes felt like artifacts from a previous life. Implementation was challenging in ways I'd expected, and several ways I hadn't. The technical work was complex but manageable. The real difficulty was organizational, coordinating with dozens of different departments and hundreds of individual users who had their own ideas about how technology should work. But the results spoke for themselves. Within 90 days, DataCorp's Eastern Division was operating with efficiency levels they'd never achieved before. Interdepartmental communication improved dramatically. Processing times for client requests dropped by 40%. Data accuracy increased across every measurable metric. More importantly, from my perspective, the implementation was generating attention from other companies facing similar challenges. My phone was ringing constantly with inquiries from potential clients who'd heard about what we were accomplishing at DataCorp. The success was creating its own momentum, and opportunities were multiplying faster than I could evaluate them. Lisa was handling the incoming business development inquiries, but she was also fielding a different kind of call. Media requests from trade publications and industry analysts who wanted to understand how a small Chicago startup had landed one of the biggest technology contracts of the year. Marcus, she said one afternoon, the Wall Street Journal wants to interview you. That interview, published 3 months later under the headline The Integration Revolution, changed everything again. Suddenly I wasn't just the guy who had solved DataCorp's problem. I was the entrepreneur who had pioneered a new approach to enterprise technology integration. The article positioned me as a thought leader in a field I'd essentially created through necessity and determination. The article generated more attention than I knew how to handle. Speaking invitations from industry conferences, investment inquiries from venture capital firms, partnership proposals from established technology companies who wanted to license my platform or acquire my business outright. Each opportunity was both exhilarating and terrifying. I was operating at a level I'd never imagined possible, making decisions that would affect not just my own future but the careers of everyone who worked for me. The responsibility was enormous, but it was also energizing in ways I couldn't have predicted. The DataCorp project was completed ahead of schedule and under budget, with performance metrics that exceeded every projection we'd made during the initial proposal. Douglas Chen himself called to congratulate me on what he described as the most successful technology integration in the company's history. But the real validation came in the form of DataCorp's follow-up contract. They wanted to expand the platform to their remaining divisions, implementing the same integration approach across their entire national operation. The new contract was worth $47 million over 3 years. 2 years after starting my company in a state of personal devastation, I was running a business that had generated almost $60 million in revenue. My team had grown to 58 people. We'd moved into a headquarters building in the Loop, with views of the lake and enough space to accommodate the expansion we were planning. More clients followed. Financial firms, healthcare systems, manufacturing companies, and government agencies.
Each implementation refined our approach, expanded our capabilities, and established new benchmarks for what was possible in enterprise technology integration. The growth was exponential, but it was also sustainable because we weren't just selling a product. We were solving a fundamental problem that affected every large organization in an increasingly connected world. The market for our solution was virtually unlimited, and we were establishing ourselves as the undisputed leaders in a field we'd essentially invented. 3 years after the DataCorp breakthrough, TechFlow Solutions was generating annual revenue of $230 million. We employed over 300 people across offices in Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. Industry publications were calling us one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. But the real measure of our success wasn't financial. It was the transformation we were enabling for our clients. Companies that had been struggling with obsolete technology were becoming industry leaders. Organizations that had been paralyzed by incompatible systems were operating with unprecedented efficiency. We weren't just building a business, we were changing how entire industries approached the challenge of technological evolution. The acquisition offers started coming when our annual revenue hit $400 million. Established technology giants who wanted to buy our platform, integrate our team, and absorb our market position into their existing operations. The numbers being discussed were staggering, often in the billions of dollars. I turned them all down, not out of arrogance but out of conviction. We were building something unique, something that couldn't be replicated by simply throwing money at the problem. The moment we became part of someone else's corporate structure, we would lose the agility and innovation that made us successful in the first place. Instead, we raised capital from investors who understood our vision and were willing to support our independence. The funding round, led by a consortium of venture capital firms and strategic partners, valued TechFlow Solutions at $850 million. $850 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like a theoretical calculation rather than an actual measure of something I'd built.
But it was real, verified by auditors and analysts and investment professionals who understood how to evaluate companies like ours. I was standing in my office on the 47th floor, looking out at the city where I'd once shared takeout containers with Sarah and Jake, when the thought occurred to me. They had no idea what I'd become. In their minds, I was probably still the heartbroken guy who'd been left behind, struggling to rebuild a life that had been destroyed by their betrayal. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The text message came on a Thursday afternoon in October, almost exactly 4 years after I'd walked in on them in my bedroom. It was from Jake, the first communication I'd received from either of them since Sarah's practical phone call about dividing our possessions. "Hey man, I know this is weird, but Sarah and I are in town for her cousin's wedding. Any chance you'd want to grab coffee and catch up? I know things ended badly, but life's too short to hold grudges. Let me know." I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to process the casual tone, the assumption that enough time had passed to smooth over what they'd done. The idea that they could simply reach out and resume some kind of friendship, as if betrayal was just a temporary inconvenience rather than a fundamental breach of trust. But underneath my initial anger, I felt something else. Curiosity. What did they think had happened to me? What story had they told themselves about the man they'd left behind? Did they imagine I was still struggling, still nursing old wounds, still defined by their abandonment? I replied with an address and a time. Not a coffee shop, but the reception area of TechFlow Solutions headquarters. If they wanted to catch up, they could catch up with the truth of what I'd become. The security desk called up to my office at exactly 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. "Mr. Marcus, you have visitors." Jake Morrison and Sarah Morrison. Morrison, they'd gotten married, which shouldn't have surprised me but somehow did. The practical dissolution of our relationship had been followed by their romantic commitment to each other. They'd built their future on the ruins of mine, or so they thought. "Send them up to the 47th floor," I said. I was waiting by the elevator when the doors opened. Sarah stepped out first, and I was struck by how little she'd changed. She still had that confident stride, though she moved more carefully now, like someone conscious of being in an unfamiliar environment. Jake followed her, and he looked exactly the same except for a wedding ring and a slightly softer jawline that suggested he'd been eating well. They both stopped when they saw me, and I could watch the recognition process in real time. This was definitely Marcus, but not the Marcus they remembered. Not the guy in the too tight suit standing awkwardly at family photos. This was someone else entirely, someone who belonged in a place like this. Marcus, Sarah said, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. You look good. I feel good, I replied. Come on, let me show you around. I gave them the full tour, the reception area with its floor-to-ceiling windows and modern art installations, the conference rooms where we held client meetings and strategic planning sessions, the development floor where over 100 programmers worked on solutions that were reshaping entire industries, the executive offices, including mine, with views that stretched to the horizon. They followed me through the headquarters of TechFlow Solutions, asking polite questions about what we did and how long I'd been working there. Neither of them understood that I didn't work there. I owned it. I had built it from nothing, grown it into something that was changing the world, and they were walking through the physical manifestation of everything I'd accomplished without them. We ended the tour in my office, where I offered them seats in the conversation area overlooking the city. The same city where we'd once planned our escape from mediocrity over Chinese takeout and cheap wine. This is incredible, Jake said, gesturing toward the windows. What do you do here? I run it, I said simply. The silence that followed was profound. I could see them processing the information, trying to reconcile the man sitting across from them with the broken person they'd left behind 4 years earlier. Sarah found her voice first. You run this company. I built this company. Started it about 6 months after you two left. We're valued at $850 million now, generating annual revenue of about $400 million. We employ over 300 people and work with some of the largest organizations in the country. Jake's mouth was open, and he was staring at me like I'd just announced I was secretly a professional athlete or a movie star. $850 million, give or take, I said. The market fluctuates. They sat in stunned silence, and I found myself studying their faces, looking for signs of the people I'd once trusted with my deepest thoughts and greatest fears. But all I could see was strangers who happened to share history with someone I used to be. Marcus, Sarah said finally. I had no idea. This is amazing. You should be so proud of what you've accomplished. I am, I said. But I'm curious about something. What did you think happened to me after you left? Another silence, longer this time. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Sarah looked out the window like she was trying to find the right words somewhere in the distance. We thought you'd be okay, Jake said eventually. You were always the smart one, the responsible one. We figured you'd land on your feet, but you never called to check. We thought it would be better to give you space, Sarah added. Let you move on without reminders of what happened. I nodded, because their reasoning made perfect sense from their perspective. They'd convinced themselves that disappearing completely was an act of kindness rather than cowardice, that their silence was consideration rather than indifference. So why now? I asked. Why reach out after 4 years? Jake and Sarah exchanged a look, and I saw that same silent communication that had told me everything I needed to know in my bedroom that day. They'd discussed this, planned what they would say. We've been having some problems, Jake said finally. Financial problems. The car dealership went under last year, and Sarah's been out of work since her office closed. We're pretty deep in debt, and we thought, maybe you'd be willing to help. There it was. The real reason for their sudden interest in reconnection. Not guilt, not curiosity, not any desire to make amends for what they'd done. They needed money, and they'd remembered that Marcus had always been reliable, always willing to help when people he cared about were in trouble. Help how? I asked. Alone, Sarah said quickly. Nothing huge, just enough to get us back on our feet. Maybe $50,000. We'd pay you back with interest. $50,000. To them it probably seemed like an enormous sum, enough to solve their immediate problems and buy time to figure out their next steps. To me it was less than I spent on office coffee in a month. I leaned back in my chair and looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time since they'd arrived. They were older, more worn than I remembered. Jake's confidence had dimmed, and Sarah's certainty had been replaced by something that looked like desperation barely held in check. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said. You betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. You destroyed my marriage, my closest friendship, and my ability to trust the people I loved most. You disappeared from my life completely, offering no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the damage you'd caused. And now, 4 years later, you've decided to reach out because you need money. It's not like that, Sarah protested, but her voice lacked conviction. What's it like then? Neither of them answered, because we all knew exactly what it was like. This wasn't about reconnection or making amends. This was about exploitation, pure and simple. They'd remembered that Marcus was the kind of person who helped people in trouble, and they were gambling that enough time had passed to make their betrayal irrelevant. I'm going to tell you something, I said, standing up and walking to the window, and I want you to really listen, because this is the last conversation we're ever going to have. I turned back to face them, and I could see fear beginning to replace hope in their expressions. The night I found you together, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, everything that defined who I was as a person. I spent months feeling sorry for myself, wondering what I'd done wrong, trying to figure out how to win back people who had never valued me in the first place. Marcus, Jake started, but I held up a hand to stop him. But eventually, I realized something important. You didn't destroy my life. You freed me from a life that was too small for who I was meant to become. You forced me to discover strengths I never knew I had, to pursue ambitions I never thought I deserved, to build something that belonged entirely to me. I gestured around the office, encompassing not just the room, but everything it represented. This company, this success, this life I've built, none of it would exist if you hadn't betrayed me. Your worst impulses created the best thing that ever happened to me. So in a way, I owe you a debt of gratitude. Sarah's eyes were filling with tears, and Jake was staring at the floor like he couldn't bear to meet my gaze. But that debt doesn't extend to bailing you out of problems you created for yourselves. You made your choices 4 years ago, and I made mine. The difference is that my choices led somewhere. I walked to my desk and pressed the button that connected me to security. This is Marcus. Could you please escort my visitors to the lobby? They're finished here. The security guard arrived within minutes, professional and discreet. Sarah and Jake stood slowly, moving like people who had just received devastating news, which I supposed they had. At the door, Sarah turned back one last time. I'm sorry, she said, for everything. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I needed to say it. You're right, I replied. It doesn't mean anything now. After they left, I stood alone in my office, surrounded by the physical evidence of everything I'd accomplished without them. The view from the 47th floor stretched out before me, a city full of possibilities and opportunities that belonged to someone who had learned to create his own luck. They were gone, and this time I knew they wouldn't be back. Not because I'd been cruel, but because I'd been honest. I'd shown them exactly what they'd given up, when they chose betrayal over loyalty, immediate gratification over long-term trust. The Marcus they'd left behind had needed their approval, their presence, their validation to feel complete. The Marcus they'd just met needed nothing from them at all. He had built his own world, established his own worth, and discovered that the best revenge wasn't cruelty. It was irrelevance. Outside my window, the sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new reasons to be grateful for the strength that had been forged in the fire of their abandonment. But tonight I was content to stand in the headquarters of the company I'd built from nothing, looking out at the city where I'd once been broken, and understanding finally that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. The weeks following Sarah and Jake's visit passed in a blur of board meetings and expansion plans. TechFlow Solutions was entering its most ambitious phase yet, with contracts spanning 3 continents and revenue projections that kept our financial team working overtime. The encounter with my former life had closed a chapter I hadn't realized was still open, but it had also reminded me of something I'd been trying to ignore. My father, Richard Chen, had been conspicuously absent from every milestone in my journey. While I was building something unprecedented, while industry publications were calling me a visionary, while investment firms were valuing my company at nearly $1 billion, he remained silent. Not proud silence, not disappointed silence, just the particular kind of silence that said my achievements were irrelevant to his understanding of success. The last time we'd spoken was 18 months earlier, during a brief phone call where he'd mentioned that the hardware store he managed was struggling with inventory management. I'd offered to have my team look at their systems, maybe implement some basic improvements that could help streamline their operations. His response had been swift and dismissive. "We don't need your fancy computer nonsense, Marcus. Some problems are solved with hard work, not gadgets." That conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes, ending with his usual reminder that real success meant steady employment and reliable income, not chasing pipe dreams and startup fantasies. He'd hung up before I could explain that my pipe dreams were generating more revenue in a month than his hardware store saw in a year. But the encounter with Sarah and Jake had stirred something in me, a need for resolution that went beyond professional validation. I found myself wondering what my father thought about the trajectory of my life, now that the results were impossible to dismiss. Did he read the business journals that featured my company? Did he understand what $850 million actually meant? Did he care? The answer came on a rainy Thursday in November, delivered through my assistant's carefully neutral voice over the intercom. "Mr. Chen, your father is here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." I sat in my office chair for several seconds processing the information. Richard Chen had never visited me at work, not when I was a junior developer, and certainly not since I'd started my own company. The fact that he was here, in the lobby of TechFlow Solutions, suggested something significant had changed. "Send him up," I said. The elevator ride from the lobby to the 47th floor takes exactly 93 seconds, which I knew because I'd timed it countless times during late nights when the building was empty and I was working alone. It was enough time to prepare for difficult conversations, to center myself before challenging meetings, to transform from whoever I was in private into the version of Marcus that my company needed. But 93 seconds wasn't enough time to prepare for seeing my father in the context of everything I'd built. When the elevator doors opened and he stepped into my reception area, I felt like I was watching 2 incompatible worlds collide. Richard Chen looked exactly as I remembered him, which is to say he looked like a man who had given up on the possibility of change decades ago. Gray hair that needed cutting, clothes that were clean but showed their age, and the particular posture of someone who spent his days on his feet solving other people's problems for wages that barely covered his own. But what struck me most was how small he seemed in this environment. Not physically smaller, though the scale of the headquarters certainly dwarfed him, but diminished in some fundamental way. Like a man who had spent his entire life in rooms where he belonged and suddenly found himself somewhere he didn't understand. "Marcus," he said when he saw me approaching. His voice carried the same authoritative tone I remembered from childhood, but it felt forced now, like he was performing a version of himself that no longer fit. "Dad, this is unexpected." He looked around the reception area, taking in the modern furniture and original artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city.
His expression was unreadable, somewhere between confusion and disapproval. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Privately?" I led him to my office, watching as he absorbed the scale of the space, the quality of the furnishings, the view that stretched beyond the horizon. He didn't comment on any of it, but I could see him cataloging details, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with whatever assumptions he'd been carrying about my life. I offered him coffee, which he declined, and a seat in the conversation area, which he accepted reluctantly. For several minutes, we sat in silence, two men who shared genetics and history, but seemed to speak entirely different languages. "I saw the article," he said finally. "Which article?" "Forbes. The one about the 40 most influential entrepreneurs under 40. I had forgotten about that piece, published 3 weeks earlier as part of their annual industry spotlight. The profile had been comprehensive, covering not just my professional achievements, but the personal story behind TechFlow Solutions. They'd interviewed Rebecca Martinez from Data Corp, Douglas Chen from the board, and several other clients who had praised our work in terms that still felt surreal to read. "What did you think?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the city below. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd heard it in years. "I thought I didn't know my own son." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure either of us was ready to explore. This was the closest thing to vulnerability I'd ever heard from Richard Chen, a man who had built his identity around stoic self-reliance and practical solutions to concrete problems. "The article mentioned your divorce," he continued. "It said that's what motivated you to start the company. Among other things, I didn't know it was that bad." "The divorce?" I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine concern or simple curiosity. "You never asked." "I thought you'd tell me if you wanted me to know." It was a reasonable assumption, the kind of logic that made perfect sense if you understood relationships as transactions rather than ongoing connections. He'd given me space to share what I wanted to share, and when I hadn't shared anything, he'd assumed there was nothing to know. "Sarah cheated on me," I said. "With Jake. I came home early from work one day and found them together in our bedroom." His expression didn't change, but I saw something shift behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition maybe, or understanding. "That's why you left Chicago." "That's why I left everything. The apartment, the job, the life I thought I was building. I had to start over completely." "And you decided to start a business." "I decided to stop waiting for other people to determine my worth." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, and I could see him processing the implication. Richard Chen had spent my entire childhood and most of my adulthood making it clear that my choices were impractical, my ambitions unrealistic, my approach to life fundamentally flawed. "The Forbes article says your company is worth almost $1 billion, he said. 850 million, as of the last valuation round. I don't understand what that means."
It was an honest admission, and somehow that made it more powerful than any congratulation or apology he might have offered. He genuinely didn't understand the scale of what I'd accomplished, not because he was being dismissive, but because the numbers involved were so far outside his frame of reference that they might as well have been theoretical. "It means that if I wanted to sell the company tomorrow, that's what investors would pay for it," I explained. "But more importantly, it means that we've created something valuable enough to attract that level of investment. We're solving problems that no one else can solve, for clients who are willing to pay premium rates for premium solutions." "Like what kind of problems?" For the next 30 minutes, I walked him through the technical challenges we'd tackled, the organizational transformations we'd enabled, the efficiency gains our clients had achieved through our platform. I explained the Data Corp project, the follow-up contracts, the expansion into new markets and new industries. He listened intently, asking questions that revealed both his intelligence and his complete unfamiliarity with the world I now inhabited. He understood concepts like efficiency and problem-solving, but the scale of modern enterprise technology was as foreign to him as quantum physics. "So you're basically a consultant," he said when I finished. But for computers, it was a gross oversimplification, but it was also the closest he could come to fitting my work into categories he understood. And there was something endearing about his effort to comprehend what I did, even if the full scope remained beyond his grasp. Something like that, I agreed. And people pay you millions of dollars for this. Hundreds of millions of dollars. He was quiet again, absorbing information that challenged every assumption he'd made about the relationship between work and reward, effort and success. In his world, you earned what you worked for through physical labor and direct service. The idea that intellectual solutions could generate wealth at this scale was not just unfamiliar, but almost incomprehensible. I owe you an apology, he said suddenly. The words caught me off guard. Richard Chen was not a man who apologized, not because he was cruel, but because he rarely acknowledged making mistakes that required apology. His worldview was too rigid to accommodate much self-doubt or second-guessing. For what? For not believing in you. For thinking your ideas were impractical. For telling you to get a real job when you were already building something real. The apology was more significant than he probably realized. This wasn't just about career choices or professional validation. This was about fundamental questions of identity and worth, about the difference between who he'd thought I was and who I'd actually become. I understand why you thought that way, I said. What I was doing didn't look like work to you. It didn't fit the patterns you understood. But it was work, real work. Important work. Yes. And you were right to pursue it, even when everyone else thought you were making a mistake. Yes. He nodded slowly, and I could see him working through the implications of these acknowledgments. If I had been right about my career, what else might I have been right about that he'd dismissed? If his understanding of success had been too narrow to recognize my achievements, what other possibilities had he failed to consider? The article mentioned that you employ over 300 people, he said. 327 as of last week. That's more than most companies in our town. It's more than some companies in most towns. And they all work for you. You're responsible for their livelihoods, their families. I could see where this was leading. Richard Chen understood responsibility, understood the weight of providing for others. If he couldn't grasp the technical aspects of my work, he could at least comprehend the human impact of what I'd built. I'm responsible for creating an environment where they can do their best work, I said. But they're responsible for their own success within that environment. Still, 327 families depending on decisions you make. 327 families benefiting from opportunities I've created. It was a subtle but important distinction, the difference between burden and opportunity. I didn't carry my employees like a weight. I enabled them to carry themselves to places they couldn't have reached alone. We talked for another hour, covering territory we'd never explored before. He told me about the hardware store, about the challenges of managing inventory and customer service in an industry that was being transformed by online retail. I found myself genuinely interested in his problems, not because they were sophisticated, but because they were real. More surprisingly, I found myself offering solutions, not the kind of comprehensive platform integration that TechFlow specialized in, but smaller improvements that could make his work easier and more efficient. Simple inventory management software, basic customer relationship tools, digital marketing strategies that could help a local business compete with national chains. You'd really help with that? He asked when I finished outlining a plan for modernizing his store's operations. I'd enjoy helping with it, I said. It would be a nice change from billion-dollar infrastructure projects. I can't pay you anywhere near what your other clients pay. I'm not doing it for money, Dad. I'm doing it because you're my father, and because every business deserves to operate efficiently. For the first time since he'd arrived, Richard Chen smiled. Not the polite, reserved expression he usually wore in social situations, but something genuine and warm. Something that reminded me why I'd spent so many years hoping for his approval. I'm proud of you, Marcus, he said. I should have said that a long time ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of what you've built, and I'm proud of who you've become. The words hit harder than I'd expected. Not because I still needed his approval to feel successful, but because they represented something I'd thought was permanently lost. The possibility of connection across the gap between who he'd wanted me to be and who I'd actually become. "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you know." He stood to leave, pausing at the door to look around my office one more time. "This is really something, son. All of this. It's really something." After he left, I remained in my office as the sun set over Lake Michigan, thinking about the strange circularity of the day. Sarah and Jake had come looking for the man they'd left behind and found someone they no longer recognized. My father had come expecting to find someone he'd never understood and discovered a son he could finally see clearly. The difference was that Sarah and Jake had wanted to take something from the person I'd become, while my father had wanted to give something to him. Recognition, acknowledgement, the validation that comes not from success but from being truly seen by someone who matters. 3 months later, Richard Chen's hardware store had implemented the efficiency improvements we'd designed together. His inventory management had streamlined significantly, his customer satisfaction scores had improved measurably, and his revenue had increased by 18% in the first quarter alone. But more importantly, we'd established a new relationship built on mutual respect rather than disappointed expectations. He called me regularly now, not to ask for help but to share updates about his business, his customers, his plans for expansion. I visited him when I was traveling, bringing members of my team who were curious about small business operations and traditional retail challenges. It wasn't the relationship either of us had imagined when I was younger, but it was real and substantial in ways our previous connection had never been. We'd found common ground in the shared challenge of building something worthwhile, regardless of scale or scope. TechFlow Solutions continued to grow, expanding into international markets and developing new platforms that pushed the boundaries of what enterprise integration could achieve. The company that had started as my personal escape from betrayal had evolved into something much larger and more significant, a force for positive change in industries around the world. But the real transformation wasn't professional. It was personal. The man who had once defined himself through other people's perceptions had learned to create his own definition of worth. The person who had been destroyed by betrayal had discovered that destruction could be the first step toward construction. Standing in my office as another day ended and another began, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Not just the business milestones and financial achievements, but the emotional evolution that had made everything else possible. Sarah and Jake had given me the gift of necessity, forcing me to discover strength I'd never known I possessed. My father had given me the gift of recognition, acknowledging worth I'd created independently of his approval, but the most important gift had been the one I'd given myself permission to become someone entirely new. The city stretched out below me, full of people building their own versions of success, their own definitions of fulfillment, their own escapes from circumstances that no longer served them. Each light in each window represented someone's struggle to transform limitation into possibility, to turn endings into beginnings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new reasons to be grateful for the strength that had been forged in the fire of loss. But tonight I was content to stand in the headquarters of the company I'd built from nothing, looking out at the world I now belonged to, and understanding finally that the best revenge against those who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong. It's proving yourself right. The phone on my desk buzzed with a text message from Rebecca Martinez at DataCorp. They wanted to schedule a meeting about another expansion project, something that would dwarf even our previous collaborations. The kind of opportunity that would take TechFlow Solutions to the next level of growth and influence. I smiled and reached for the phone to respond. There was still so much to build, so much to accomplish, so many ways to transform the limitations others saw into possibilities only I could imagine. The boy who had been cut out of family photos had grown into the man who created his own picture of success,
and that picture was still being painted, one decision at a time, one achievement at a time, one day at a time. The Marcus who had been betrayed and abandoned was gone forever. In his place stood someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who understood that the most powerful form of vindication isn't making others regret what they lost. It's making yourself grateful for what you found. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.